Everyone knows Hiroshima. Almost no one knows the city that vanished before it. On December 6, 1917, Halifax, Canada, a thriving port of war, was gone in a single flash. A harbor became fire. A city fell silent before anyone could scream. 2,000 people were dead in an instant. Windows shattered 50 miles away. The blast punched a hole in the sea and threw a 30-foot wave into the coast. The shock was so great, survivors thought the world itself had cracked open beneath them. To the people of Halifax, it felt like the end of days. Some swore the sun had exploded. Others whispered it was a German attack, a secret weapon. They didn't know they were witnessing the greatest man-made explosion in history, until Hiroshima, decades later. But this wasn't Japan in 1945. This was Canada, 28 years earlier, and Halifax would carry scars no one outside its borders remembered. A nuclear-scale disaster before nuclear weapons existed. And it began not with bombs, but with 2 ships in the harbor. One loaded with explosives, one pushing for time. The channel narrowed, horns blared, signals were ignored, and in the next minutes, Halifax would vanish. Before Hiroshima, before Nagasaki, there was Halifax, the first city destroyed by a man-made firestorm. The first ship was called the Mont Blanc. It was small, French, and carried enough death to level a city. On board, nearly 3,000 tons of TNT, picric acid and benzol, stacked in barrels like cargo, but together forming a floating bomb. The crew lived with the knowledge that one spark, one careless strike of metal, could send them all into smoke. Every step on deck was deliberate, every lantern shielded. They knew they were sailing a ship that could erase Halifax if it ever caught fire. But Halifax harbor was crowded. The war in Europe had turned the Atlantic into a pipeline of supplies. Fishing boats, troop transports, merchant freighters all jammed the Narrows. And through that bottleneck came another ship, the Norwegian freighter Imo, impatient, late, and unwilling to yield. The Imo wasn't armed. It wasn't dangerous on its own, but its captain pushed hard, cutting against traffic, blowing horns. 2 ships now faced each other in a narrowing passage, one carrying arrogance, the other carrying enough firepower to burn a nation. Horns blared, signals were ignored. The Imo tried to squeeze past. The Mont Blanc swung to avoid. Steel scraped against steel, sending sparks across the deck. Flames erupted instantly, and Halifax had only minutes left before the floating bomb lit the sky. To the people of Halifax, it looked like nothing more than a ship fire. The Mont Blanc drifted, smoke pouring from its deck. Flames licked at the barrels. The crowd only saw spectacle. A burning ship in the harbor was something worth watching. Children climbed fences to get a better view. Workers pressed their faces to glass windows. Shopkeepers leaned in their doorways, curious, not afraid. They didn't realize that every second the flames spread, the countdown ticked louder. Every laugh, every shout was time lost. One French officer shouted warnings. He waved his arms, screamed for people to run, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire. Crowds stood rooted, unable to imagine that the fire before them was only the opening act of something unimaginable. Across the city, telephones rang. One operator stayed at her switchboard as panic spread, shouting warnings through the lines. "Get away from the harbor! The ship is full of explosives!" Some heard her, most didn't, and the Mont Blanc burned hotter. By 9 o'clock, the waterfront was packed. Hundreds lined the docks. Families pointed toward the rising smoke. The Mont Blanc drifted closer. Its deck was a furnace. At 9:04 a.m., the fire reached the hold, and the sky itself prepared to ignite. The Mont Blanc didn't just explode, it disintegrated. 3,000 tons of explosives ripped the ship into fragments so fast the human eye couldn't follow. One instant there was fire, the next, Halifax was hit by a weapon that hadn't even been invented yet. The shockwave raced outward at nearly 2% the speed of sound. Warehouses disintegrated into splinters. Stone churches crumbled in an instant. Houses toppled like toys. Entire neighborhoods disappeared into dust. The city wasn't burning anymore. It was being erased, block by block, in less than a minute. The blast hurled anchors weighing half a ton more than 2 miles inland. A child's body was found on a rooftop. Iron shards fell like rain, slicing anything in their path. The air itself had become a weapon, turning steel and flesh into shrapnel. Glass shattered 50 miles away. People standing at their windows were blinded instantly as shards became knives. Across Halifax, thousands staggered through smoke without sight, their eyes shredded by invisible blades. In one instant, more people went blind than in any single day of war. And above it all, a mushroom cloud rose 2,000 feet into the sky. Survivors stared in silence, convinced the sun itself had exploded. 2,000 people were dead. 9,000 more were wounded. In less than a minute, Halifax had ceased to exist. The destruction didn't end with the blast. In seconds, hundreds of small fires merged into a single wall of flame. The winter wind turned streets into chimneys, pulling fire through broken windows and shattered rooftops. The city that had just been flattened was now burning alive. Wooden houses, split in half, burst into flames where they lay. Oil lamps toppled and ignited curtains. Flour dust hanging in the air exploded like gunpowder inside bakeries. Survivors stumbled through thick smoke, their clothes smoldering, their skin already torn by shards of flying glass. Mothers carried children who no longer moved. Men clawed at rubble with raw, bleeding hands, passing bricks in chains. Neighbors screamed names into the smoke, voices swallowed by the roar of flame. Every rescue attempt was met by new collapses, sparks showering down like burning rain. Churches became hospitals. Kitchen tables became operating boards. Doctors pulled shards of glass from eyes, washing wounds with carbolic acid in the half-light. Inside one church, pews were stacked with the injured. The moans of hundreds filled the same halls where hymns had been sung. The screams echoed across the harbor, then slowly fell silent. Ash rained from the sky like grey snow. The fire line moved downhill toward the waterfront, devouring what the blast had spared. And as the smoke thickened, the sea itself began to stir. The explosion had torn a hole in the harbor itself. For a moment, the sea pulled back, exposing muddy seabed and broken pilings. Fish flopped in the open air. Then the water returned all at once, not as a wave, but as a wall. 30 feet high, the surge crashed into the docks. Small skiffs were hurled like splinters against warehouses. Buildings that had survived the blast were torn open and swept clean. Men running on the piers disappeared in spray, swallowed before they could even finish their last breath. Streets became rivers flowing backward. Trolley tracks vanished under brown water. Boxcars toppled like children's toys. Families who had gathered in second-story windows were suddenly waist-deep in floodwater. The sea had come to claim the survivors who thought they had escaped the fire. Sailors were hurled into alleys, choking on seawater where no tide had ever reached. Fishermen drowned in their kitchens. A few men tied ropes from window to window and passed children along, bleeding hands gripping until the current ripped the last rescuer away. When the water withdrew, it left boats stranded in gardens and nets tangled in trees. Steam rose from the drowned ruins. For those who had survived the fire, the flood finished the work. Halifax did not breathe. It only smoldered. The Halifax blast was not confined to Halifax. Far away, the earth itself recorded it. In Prince Edward Island, windows shattered as if struck by invisible hammers. People stared at their own homes in disbelief, asking how a city across the water could reach them. In Boston, 200 miles away, seismographs shuddered as if recording an earthquake. The needle scratched a violent line across the roll. Operators grabbed phones, asking if the ground had moved beneath them. No one believed an explosion that far away could cause it. Telegrams flew ahead of the smoke. By evening, newspapers thundered with presses calling Halifax the site of the greatest man-made explosion in history. Maps marked the city as a blank circle, as though it had been erased by a compass rather than a weapon. Relief trains left Boston before dawn, packed with doctors, nurses, and supplies. Snowstorms blocked the rails, forcing men to shovel tracks by hand ahead of locomotives. When they arrived, they stepped into silence, a city drowned, burned, and still steaming in the winter air. For decades, Halifax held the record as the largest man-made explosion in history. Only Hiroshima and Nagasaki would surpass it. But by then, the world had already forgotten Halifax. What remained was not just ruins, but a warning, erased by a larger catastrophe. In 1945, when Hiroshima vanished in fire, some survivors of Halifax recognized the sight. The white flash, the rising cloud, the silence that followed. They whispered, "We've seen this before." But history didn't write Halifax into memory. It wrote Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Halifax disaster became a footnote. Children in Canada learned fragments of it. The rest of the world moved on. It was overshadowed, buried under the mushroom clouds of the nuclear age. The first Hiroshima erased, not by fire, but by forgetting. Yet the truth remains. Before the Manhattan Project, before the nuclear bomb, one city had already been sacrificed. A community erased by a chain of arrogance, chance, and fire. Halifax was the first modern warning, and we ignored it. Halifax was a Hiroshima without uranium, without scientists, without a bomber overhead. It proved that humans didn't need atomic power to create hell on Earth. All it took was greed, hurry, and silence, the kind of silence that ignores every warning.